Just before the video begins, please subscribe and like the videos to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching.
Then my father, he was a merchant seaman, you know, you can imagine, and it was 1940s in the war and all that.
Alfred Lennon, known to his friends as Alf or Fred, was born on the 14th of December 1912. He spent most of his childhood brought up in an orphanage, and as a child wore leg braces, which led his growth to be stunted at 5'4". When he first met John's mother Julia, she told him the top hat he was wearing looked silly, so he threw it into a nearby lake. From that day, he never wore a hat again. John's Aunt Mimi didn't care for Fred Lennon. She later said, "We knew he would be no use to anyone, especially not our Julia." Julia's parents shared the same thoughts and wouldn't allow him into their house. Fred was abandoned by his father as a child. He then abandoned John, and John later abandoned his son Julian. Julian never married and remains childless to this day. His difficult relationship with his father has been cited as the reason. Fred made no attempt to contact John until the height of Beatlemania. He was working as a kitchen porter when someone showed him a newspaper with John on the front cover. During the morning of the 1st of April 1964, Fred Lennon, along with a journalist, walked into the offices of Lennons Enterprises. He told the receptionist he was John Lennon's father and Brian Epstein was contacted. Brian panicked and a car was immediately sent to bring John to the offices. On arrival, his first words to his father were, "What do you want?" They spoke for 20 minutes before John threw him out the offices. The encounter was kept out of the newspapers in exchange for exclusive stories given to journalists, but despite this, Fred sold his story to newspapers. Lennon Sr. told the newspapers he'd never heard of the Beatles until around the height of Beatlemania. The Greyhound Hotel in Hampton, South London, where he worked as a kitchen porter, was not far from John's home, and a few weeks later, Fred knocked the door at Kenwood. Cynthia opened the door to, in her words, what looked like a tramp, but alarmingly, with John's face. John wasn't home and Cynthia gave him cheese on toast and tea as he waited. Cynthia then offered to cut Fred's long stringy locks of hair, which he allowed her to do. After waiting 2 hours with no sign of John, Fred left. When John came home, Cynthia told him about the events of the day which aggravated John. He told Cynthia for the first time about Fred's visit to Nem's offices weeks previous. After he'd calmed down, John changed his mind and contacted Fred, telling Cynthia, "Alright, Cyn, he's a bit wacky like me." In the following months, Fred released a single called "That's My Life, My Love and My Home." On release, the song was commercially successful. John contacted Brian Epstein and told him to do anything he could to stop the recording becoming a hit. It quickly disappeared from the charts, and Fred suspected John was the cause. Fred had written the song with Tony Cartwright, and the pair drove to Kenwood to confront John about their suspicions. John slammed the door in their face, and for now, Fred drifted back to obscurity. 2 years later, in 1967, Fred, now 56 years old, turned up at Kenwood once again. This time he was with his 20-year-old fiancée Pauline Jones. John greeted the couple warmly. Perhaps the letter John received from Fred's brother was the catalyst. In it, Charlie Lennon had claimed Julia was the person John should be angry with, not Fred, with claims of infidelity. Fred asked John if he could give Pauline a job, so she was hired to help, looking after John's son Julian and managing the piles of fan mail. For a brief period, she lived in the attic at Kenwood. She later said of the time living with John, "My impression of living with John was that he was totally withdrawn into himself when living at home. Unsmiling, cold and unapproachable, His thoughts and feelings appeared tightly guarded. John provided Fred with an apartment and he was put on the Beatles' payroll. Each month he was paid £12. That's the equivalent of £2,300 in 2023. He later bought the couple a house in Brighton for £6,500 and didn't see much of his father for the next 3 years. When John turned 30, he invited his father to Tittenhurst Park, the home he'd moved into after Kenwood. At this time, John had been doing primal therapy, a psychotherapy used to re-experience childhood trauma in an attempt to resolve the pain. Fred arrived with Pauline at John's home and from the get-go had an eerie feeling. The property to him seemed more like a mausoleum than a home. He reportedly said to Pauline, "This place positively reeks of evil." At that moment, John appeared with Yoko descending the circling staircase, his pupils dilated. He looked like a man possessed. "Start worrying. Go on, start worrying," John began, before screaming at Fred. Fred was shocked by both John's appearance and his actions. Pauline burst into tears. She attempted to defend Fred in between sobs, but this only infuriated John more. John shouted, "Mind your own business, you stupid cow," and then slammed his fists down onto the table. The whole time Yoko sat stone-faced staring at the couple. Fred tried to calm the situation and admitted he was partly to blame for what had happened to John. John went into another rage and began rambling nonsensically, comparing himself to Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, all of whom had recently died. The whole time John was screaming with such force the couple were terrified. He began ranting about his mother and his Aunt Mimi. Fred later wrote, "I sat through all this completely stunned." Fred claimed John told him if he were to speak to the press again, he would have him shot and have his body dumped at sea. It was the only point in the rant John didn't look insane with rage. The idea of killing Fred filled him with glee. The couple fled Tittenhurst Park in fear. A week later, they were contacted by Apple Corps and told they must vacate their home in Brighton. John and Fred would never see each other face to face again. The next contact they would have would be on Fred's deathbed. Late in his life, Fred wrote a manuscript detailing his life story, which he bequeathed to John. It was his attempt to fill in the lost years where he had not been in contact with his son, and to explain that it was Julia, not Fred, who had broken up their marriage. John later commented, "You know, all he wanted was for me to hear his side of the story, which I hadn't heard." By 1976, Fred was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. Pauline contacted John via Apple Corps to make sure that he knew that his father was dying. John sent a large bouquet of flowers to the hospital and phoned Alf on his deathbed, apologising for his past behaviour. In 1990, Pauline published a book called Daddy Come Home, detailing her life with Fred and his meetings with John. The only thing remaining today of Fred Lennon is the single he released. Ironically, in the song, the lyrics read, "It started in Liverpool, where I was born, no father to advise me, but I carried on.